It was a normal morning in the city, with the streets filled with the fast movement of people coming and going, their shadows stretching out under the scorching sun. Lucas walked along the sidewalks, listening to the muffled sound of music on his headphones, completely immersed in the world his mind created as he thought about the future. He was 17 years old, a teenager with big dreams and a whole life ahead of him. But that day, the journey would be cut short in a tragic and brutal way. He barely noticed the police car approaching until suddenly the sound of a siren broke the silence of the street. Officer Mendez, a burly, stern-looking man, quickly got out of the car and headed straight for Lucas. The tension on the street was palpable, a constant reminder of the gulf between the black population and the police. Mendez, like many other officers, saw every young black man as a potential threat, even though there was no reason to distrust Lucas. "You there?" Mendez shouted, his voice hoarse and authoritative. "Stop right there!" Lucas stopped in surprise. He knew the dynamics. He knew that if he made one wrong move, the situation could escalate quickly. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, trying not to attract any more attention. But his heart was beating fast and fear was growing in his chest. He had no idea that in just a few seconds, his life would be taken away in a way the world could never accept. "I'm leaving school, sir." Lucas tried to explain himself, but he didn't get a chance to finish the sentence. Mendez took a firm step forward and shouted, "Are you challenging me?" The tone was threatening. Lucas swallowed hard. Not knowing what else to do, he took a step back, wanting to get away from the situation before something worse happened. But Mendez had already made up his mind. In a quick and impulsive movement, the police officer drew his gun and fired. The sound of the shot was muffled by the boy's scream, but the scene unfolded at a cruel speed. Lucas fell to the ground, his body still stretched out, while blood began to spread across the street. Witnesses were shocked. Some ran to help, others filmed, but all were paralyzed by the violence of an act that should never have happened. Mendez returned to patrol, but the weight of his decision had not yet sunk in as deeply as it was about to. Little did he know at the time that his life would also change forever, and that what he had just done would not be something he could control or hide. The silence that took over the house was profound, broken only by the sound of the phone ringing incessantly on the dining room table. In the living room was Carla, Lucas's mother, still recovering from a turbulent morning. Her thoughts were distant, wandering between tiredness and expectations about her son's future. Lucas was her only son, and she had always protected him with all the affection a mother could offer. The ringing of the phone brought her back to reality, but little did she know that the call would be the breaking point in her life. "Mrs. Lucas, you need to come to the hospital. Your son was shot." The police officer's voice, muffled and almost unrecognizable, seemed distant, as if it were coming from another world. The shock was immediate. Carla couldn't understand the words. Not knowing what to do, she grabbed her bag and ran to the hospital. A feeling of panic took over her body, and the only thing she could think was that she couldn't lose the only child she had. When she arrived at the hospital, a doctor approached her with a serious expression. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Unfortunately, we couldn't," he began, but his voice trailed off before he could finish the sentence. Carla felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. The words echoed in her mind without being able to be processed. Her son was dead, murdered, and nothing could change that. As the pain took over her mind, something else rose from her heart, a silent cry for revenge. She didn't know how, but something inside her told her that justice had to be served, no matter the cost. It was at this moment that Carlos, Carla's ex-husband, was admitted to the hospital. He didn't need words. His gaze was the same as always, strong, unfazed, but inside he was falling apart. Carlos was a famous police officer, respected for his bravery and his fight against racism within the force. He knew very well that his career had been marked by struggles, but he never imagined that his own blood would have to pay the price for a corrupt system. Carla, her grief still fresh, revealed something to Carlos that he had never known. Lucas, her son, was actually more than the boy Carlos had always thought he was. Unbeknownst to his father, he had become an active supporter of the same causes that Carlos had once embraced. This, in a way, deepened the former police officer's grief. Now, his son's death would not only be a personal loss, but a direct affront to everything he believed in. With that, Carlos's fight began. The pain of loss would be the motivation, but the revelation of who Lucas really was would be the strength to not rest until justice was served. The pain of loss was still fresh in Carla and Carlos's minds, but it was soon replaced by a silent and determined anger. Lucas's case made headlines all over the city, and protests began to emerge, further intensifying the tension. But for Carla and Carlos, the fight was just beginning. They knew that the pain of losing a son would be eternal, but the pain of knowing that his death could have been prevented, or worse, ignored, was unbearable. Carlos, with his experience as a police officer, knew what was at stake. This was not just a matter of justice for his son, but also a fight against the system that had allowed such actions to happen again and again for so long. He knew how police officers protected themselves, how the truth was often hidden behind lies and manipulation. But this was no longer about him or his past. It was about his son, and he was willing to do anything to expose what had really happened. He sought help from Ricardo, a lawyer known for his boldness in defending just and difficult causes. Ricardo hesitated at first, aware of the power of the system, but something in Carlos's determination convinced him. Together they began to unearth the details of the case, focusing on the videos and witnesses, which were still scarce, but which could shed light on the truth. Meanwhile, Carla, not fully understanding the full extent of what was happening, tried to deal with the loss in a different way. She focused on the emotional issues, on the void left by Lucas. But as the case progressed and the pressure from the media grew, she was forced to face the reality of the struggle. She began to participate in protests, talk to other parents who had lost their children to police violence, and make Lucas's voice resound throughout the city. The media was all over the case, and Lucas's story spread like wildfire. The video of the attack, although it did not capture the actual shooting, clearly showed the tension and brutality that Mendez exerted on the boy. Witnesses, despite their fear, began to speak out, and little by little the details of the interaction between the officer and Lucas were revealed. But what really caught everyone's attention was the moment Lucas revealed himself on social media before he died. Without anyone knowing, he began recording a series of videos talking about his experience with racism and police prejudice. The revelation that he had already recorded, with frightening coldness, the behavior of some police officers, including Mendez, transformed the case not only into a tragedy, but into a symbol of the fight against oppression. The battle for justice was in full swing, but there were still many obstacles ahead, and Carlos and Carla knew that their journey was just beginning. As Lucas's case gained more visibility, pressure on authorities and the police increased. Carlos and Ricardo stepped up their investigations, and the videos that Lucas had so courageously recorded began to spread on social media. These videos, in which Lucas spoke openly about his experience with systemic racism and police brutality, became a symbol of resistance, and even more so, a desperate cry for change. As the videos went viral, the case was covered by newspapers, television programs, and influencers who, previously distant from Lucas's reality, were now deeply involved in the fight for his memory. The entire country mobilized, and the impact was instantaneous. Popular outrage took to the streets in demonstrations that spread like a wave, demanding justice for Lucas and all other young black victims of police violence. Meanwhile, Mendez, the police officer responsible for Lucas's murder, found himself in an increasingly untenable situation. The pressure on him and the police institution intensified, and his name appeared constantly in the news. He, who had previously felt safe and unpunished in his position, began to realize that his world was falling apart. This was not just an isolated mistake. Lucas's murder became a reflection of deeply rooted flaws and prejudices within the police force itself. Carla, still consumed by the pain of her loss, found strength in something she never imagined she would have: her voice. Lucas's case became more than a personal struggle. It became a movement to ensure that no other young black man would be treated the same way. She became a regular presence at demonstrations, rallies, and meetings with activists, where she shared her experience and the promises of justice that had yet to be fulfilled. Her grief transformed her into an unstoppable force. On the other hand, Carlos, with his experience as a former police officer, knew that the legal battle would be arduous and slow. The system, with all its protective structure, would not give in easily. However, he also knew that visibility and media pressure would be his greatest allies. Lucas's videos, the witnesses, and the popular mobilization were the tools that could finally open the doors to true justice. But despite all the victories that seemed to have been achieved on the streets and in the media, the fight was far from over. The legal process was just beginning, and the system continued to protect itself, creating new obstacles at every step. There was still much to be done, and Carlos knew that the journey would be long. As Lucas's case gained momentum, it sparked a new wave of reflection on structural racism in policing and institutions. Carlos, although he had faced challenges in his own career, never imagined that one day his own morals would be put to such a severe test. As a police officer, he was familiar with the tensions within the force, the impunity practices, and the unequal treatment, but he never thought the impact of this would be so close. Now the face of injustice was his own son. In the days that followed the growing movement around Lucas, Carlos began to reconsider his own career within the police force. For years, he believed he was fighting for justice, trying to change the institution from within. But now he was faced with a bitter truth. His silence and his submission to the system contributed in some way to the perpetuation of a culture of violence and racism. In a meeting with Ricardo, his lawyer, Carlos revealed his darkest thoughts. "I was consumed by guilt and doubt. There were times throughout his career when he knew something was wrong, but he always kept quiet, accepting the status quo for fear of damaging his career. Now, I didn't know how to live with this reality. The pain of losing Lucas was unbearable, but the anguish of having contributed even indirectly to the violence that killed him was even more overwhelming. I should have done more. I should have seen," Carlos mumbled, his voice trailing off. Ricardo, ever the pragmatist, looked at him with profound seriousness. He knew the former police officer faced a complex moral dilemma, but he also knew that the real fight was now. It was no longer about him or his past, but about justice for Lucas. "Now you have a choice, Carlos," Ricardo said firmly. "You can use everything you know, everything you have learned, to change things once and for all. You can turn pain into action." Carlos looked at the lawyer, feeling the truth of those words resonate in his mind. The fight would not be easy, but he had a responsibility to Lucas and to the future. He could still make a difference, and that was becoming increasingly clear in his mind. Meanwhile, Carla continued her battle in the streets, her voice growing louder. He knew that the pain of losing a son would never go away, but his mission now was one: to ensure that Lucas's name would never be forgotten and that his sacrifice would be the spark of a movement of profound transformation.